Welcome to another episode of Power of the Mind, the podcast where we give you simple tools to help you understand yourself and other people. Today we're going to talk a little bit about the shadow, the dark side of the human psyche. We'll explain what the shadow is and why it can be of great value to learn about it and to own it so it doesn't own you. Stay tuned.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Cast 11 with Talking Glass Media. I'm Alicia and I've got Greg Struve here today for Power of the Mind.
Hello.
We've got new microphones today. You guys can't see us, but we're doing an all audio podcast today, which is, kind of usually the way the podcasts are done. But we are joined today with a couple guests. So it was a little easier just to do audio. So how are you doing, Greg?
I'm doing awesome.
Today we've got Christina Abbey here. She is our assistant editor and I like to call it like hobby writer type.
Something like that. Yeah, absolutely.
Like that.
And hello.
Hello. And we've got Marilee Mills. She's our doer of all things, media manager, and getting ready to have a couple babies.
Yes.
Some twins.
Babies. Quite large.
Yeah. So, today it's Welcome to the Dark Side, presented by Granite Mountain Behavioral Healthcare. So Let's get dark.
Well, we're going to talk about the shadow today.
The shadow.
Yeah. Just a really interesting concept. It's a Jungian concept. Okay, so back in the day, there were these guys. One guy's name was Sigmund Freud. Most people have heard of Siggy, and he's best known for his theory about the Oedipal complex, which I think was not particularly popular then and certainly isn't particularly popular now. But it is kind of what his hallmark was, his calling card was. And most of psychology has moved on from Freudian stuff, although the neo-Freudian, the new Freudian stuff is still shows up in a lot of different forms of what they call depth psychology. Depth psychology is different than what is sort of more commonly practiced now. Now we do evidence-based psychology, which is interesting some of the time, but tends to strip away a lot of the human factor in providing care, right? So if you do evidence-based stuff, what that means is it's scientifically provable, and that means you have to do kind of the same stuff from clinician to clinician, and you lose a lot of the human touch with it. So evidence-based material, I think, has a lot to it, but it's the depth psychology stuff is really fun. Anyway, Siggy gets into an argument with his buddy, Carl Gustav Jung, because Jung comes up with the idea, well, all kinds of stuff, actually. Jung eventually really, really broke away from Freud and became obsessed with spirituality. So that was his jam. One of the things that Jung felt like he uncovered as he journeyed into his own unconscious, he had 4 or 5 years where he was just spending a lot of time journaling in ways that were very particular to him and digging into his own unconscious, and he found this thing he called the shadow. And the shadow is like the dumpster fire of the psyche. So all the stuff that you wish wasn't true about you, all the things you kind of wish you could do, but you don't want to know that about yourself, that all ends up in the shadow. So the bad guy in the movie is the shadow within all of us, most of us at least. That's what Jung would say. All of us have a shadow. The bad guy in the horror movie is also the shadow. And all human beings have that. And if we're going to be acculturated appropriately, if we're going to not bite our friends in grade school and all that stuff, or adulthood, true. I mean, certainly there are people who have challenges with that stuff too. We have to take all those instincts and inspirations and put them someplace, and they wind up in the shadow. So that's the thing we were going to talk about today. We had a great conversation offline, so I said, you guys, we got to talk about this online and record it.
Stop, rearrange mics, add some people in here. So
boom, let's do it.
Yeah, so how do you want to get started with this?
Man, I don't know.
My first question goes to, so we all have shadows, right? So
Jung would say we do.
Most
of us would prefer not to think we have a shadow. Right. We all think that we're good people.
Perfect.
Yeah,
perfect people.
Good people. I get a kick out of it when a clinician tells me they're a good person, or a client tells me they're a good person.
Trust me.
You don't know yourself very well, actually. There's a darkness. Everybody has a bit of darkness. Most of us have a lot of darkness. If you want to find out if you're really a good person, go without food for about 3 days and figure out what you'll do for food, if not for you, for your family, and you'll find out some of the stuff. And that's not even the shadow. The shadow actually is the part of us that enjoys being naughty and gets a kick out of hurting other people.
Is the shadow a little bit of, you pass a car accident and it's that sick fascination of what happened, or am I going to see something?
Oh man, for sure. Yeah, like you want to look away, but you can't. Yeah, that's exactly that.
So if I don't want to look, that means I'm pure of
Oh,
heart,
yes,
right?
absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, totally. You can pick up the hammer.
Yeah.
You should be fine.
You're like an angelic Disney princess.
Because I
Like
don't
a
want to
Disney
see
princess.
it. Like, it's my kids will, oh, Mom, do you hear what happened? Don't tell me. I don't want to hear it. I don't want to hear it at all. So I'm pure of heart.
Yeah, totally. That's
Perfect.
great.
Or I've just tapped into my shadow so much that,
That could be it too.
Your shadow's just your normal.
yeah, it's just me.
Yeah.
So what I found fascinating is what Mary Lee was saying too about, listening or watching like murder shows. Mm-hmm. And so I thought that was pretty
True
fascinating.
crime, podcast, documentary, any format. Photos of real life crime scenes I can
Right.
do. And it's a huge thing right now. It's almost trendy.
True crime. Did you guys see the Hulu show with Steve Martin on it?
No.
Oh my gosh, it
You've
is
been telling me about
delightful.
that. I need to
It
see
is
that.
so good.
What is it
so
called?
funny.
Selena Gomez.
It's called The Only Murders in the Building, and it is
Okay.
hysterically funny and really, and it's a true crime. It doesn't quite satirize a true crime podcast. It's not the right way of putting it, but it is just so well done. But
Okay.
yeah, it kind of gets
I'll
into
go
that
and
world
watch
and
it. Yeah.
points out how big that sort of
It's huge.
niche in
The
the,
whole
podcasting.
industry.
Yeah.
Yeah, it really is. But then, to Alicia's point, I can't watch horror movies. I cannot hear about paranormal. I can't do ghosts. I can't do any of that. But someone getting murdered, fine.
Yeah, and so a Jungian analyst would say that you have uncovered, maybe connected with a certain part of the shadow where you can really sort of allow yourself to enjoy the true reality
real
of someone
part of it?
else's
Yeah.
being murdered in a grisly, awful fashion, right?
Yeah.
And there can be a lot of reasons for that. One of them would be this sort of it's socially okay, right? It's socially allowed. And that's actually a horror movie. Horror, I can't remember what the statistic is exactly. I think horror movies have the most, cartoons make the most per movie. Cartoons are the highest. Rated G movies make more per movie than most movies. But I think if you were to take all of the movie industry and look at the money it makes in a year, I think horror owns like a really sizable portion of it, like 30 or 40%. And it's a socially allowed way for people to kind of get in touch with that shadow, that dark side of themselves. Like, I'm going to go to a horror movie and get scared. And what they don't necessarily own, but is usually there, is I'm going to actually kind of enjoy the process of this tragedy unfolding in front of me, this horrible, awful thing unfolding in front
The
of me.
adrenaline you kind of get from jump scares.
Yeah,
It all
yeah.
feeds into it.
The whole thing. And I like that Geico commercial when they come out and they say, oh my gosh, what should we do? Should we get into that running car, that unlocked running car?
No,
the guy
let's
says,
go into the shed.
Let's go to the shed with all those chainsaws and power tools.
Yeah.
Let's run over there, right? Like, that's such an archetypal horror movie thing, right? And that's part of any good tragedy. They always have to have that. You saw it in Breaking Bad too, the cultural fascination with Breaking Bad and the idea of it being really a pretty tour de force as a TV show. And part of it is consistently he has chances to go back. Consistently, and you sit there and think, come on, man, don't do it.
Thing.
Yeah.
Don't do it. Don't do
He
it.
does it.
But he does it anyway.
And you were
then-
kind of rooting for that.
But then you're kind of like, oh, he did it.
You did it. Let's go.
Right? I want him to do it, but then I don't. And that's really, that's the interesting thing when you really start to understand the psyche, is you also recognize that within the shadow is the opposite of almost everything we want. So there are a lot of different spaces that it comes out.
But you want it a little. Like
oh, yeah.
Christina said, you want to look at that car crash a little bit. Like, it's the opposite of what you want to happen, but you want to look at it.
And so there's a whole idea with psychology and counseling. Like, sometimes what I'm doing with a client, or what a client is doing, is they're trying not to get better. I'll tell people, I say, the goal isn't to get better. You can't, that won't work. The goal is to get wholer, right? Is to integrate the parts of yourself that you wish weren't there, and to acknowledge them, and to accept them, and to deal with them as as is appropriate and necessary. Because what you ignore owns you. It squeaks out the side. What you don't own owns you. And you'll see that in the culture. You'll see whole segments of the culture that don't own their shadow, and it all comes out. It comes out in horrible, awful ways culturally. You know, the Germans in the 30s are probably a good example of people, you know, as a culture, right? It became a thing where a whole group of people didn't own their shadow, and they slowly became more and more sort of vehement and dangerous until, you know, you agreed with them or you died. But the whole culture became corrupt over the course of that 10 to 15 year period prior to the war beginning. You saw the entire group of people just kind of jumping on board. And you see that also, we've talked on this show before about the impact of the news media and how it works, and it loves tapping into that stuff. You know?
Yeah,
So
it really
what would be
does.
the difference of, I would rather read a good like Stephen King book than watch
Sure.
the movie? Because in my mind, it's like, I can imagine things better than anything that they can reenact.
Oh,
And
yeah.
so-
My brain makes it better movie for sure. And Stephen King describes it better.
He does.
know?
Better than what? And so is that tapping into the shadow a little bit? Because I can imagine that part, or, you know.
Yeah,
imagine
totally.
that.
I mean, both sides are really, a movie or a book. You know, again, what is our fascination with reading this kind of material, this kind of macabre
Yeah.
material? And it just is like, wow. And the other idea, of course, is that we watch movies and TV shows and things like that so we can learn. That's the one theory underneath it. Is so
How to
like,
hide a body, right?
yeah, how to hide a body. What do I do if there's big trouble and I need to, you know, go be the gladiator or whatever it is? You know, we want to figure out how to master our domain somehow. And we believe movies do that. They teach us. We're most interested in movies that teach us something about ourselves, is the theory anyway. And I think there's some practical reality to it. You know, so what do I do? And but the horror movie doesn't really go with that, does it? Because most horror movies are tragedies in the literary sense.
Well, and the bad guy always loses, right? Like they
Well,
always
some
catch,
horror movies
usually,
they catch the
yeah.
bad guy, but sometimes they don't die in the end.
Michael Myers, there's another one coming out. Another Halloween movie.
Silence of the Lambs.
Sure.
No.
That one scared
He
the
just
heck out of me.
He's hanging out in a tropical island. Good for him.
He just
Yeah.
sticks to it, huh? Is it Anthony Hopkins again or
Yeah.
no? Gosh, he's got to be like 80.
Yeah.
Well,
That's
good for
crazy.
him. It's probably fun to keep playing that part.
And he does a great job.
He does do a good job.
Yeah, maybe you'll be like that one day.
You know, I remember
Tropical.
I remember reading an article after, was it Heath Ledger who played the Joker and died, right? After Heath Ledger died, I read an article and they said that Jack Nicholson called him and said, "Hey man, be careful with this part." Because Jack Nicholson had played the Joker before Heath Ledger did. He said it'll tap into a part of you that like you can't put back in the box once it's out,
Wow.
you know?
Well, look at Joaquin Phoenix did the same type of role
the
where
Joker.
where it was just watching him, and they said so much of what he was doing was ad-libbed. And like the one part where he was on the stairs and dancing, they said that was all ad-libbed of him, and it was just that to me is the ultimate tapping into that shadow and letting that
Yeah.
overtake you and showing that part to the world a little bit. So
Yeah, it's so interesting.
So it's like the artistic side of tapping into the shadow, which, you know, in writing.
Yeah.
I do that sometimes. I participate in this thing every year where I try to write a short novel every November. And
Oh, cool.
part of it
How long you been
is,
doing that?
Since 2013.
Wow, that's really neat. So you're an author, you like writing?
I like to write, yeah.
One of my favorite phrases, quotes about writing is, if you're really a writer, you write because you have to, not because you want to. Right? I really resonate with that. Like it comes whether you want it to or not. Like you're sort of like almost obligated to write. Like it just comes out of you no matter what.
Oh, well, yeah. I
that fit
mean,
for
like
you?
with writing, I've learned if you wait for the ideal time or when you're in the mood, it's never going to happen. You're never going to be in the mood to sit down and write. You just do it.
It's when the muse strikes you, you go at it, huh?
The muse will strike often while I'm already going at it.
Oh.
So something will happen, a character will say something, or a scene will happen, and it's like, I know what I want to happen. But yeah, as far as like the shadow side, kind of going into that is part of this November thing that I do. We always try to incorporate every author that participates in this thing annually.
Yeah.
They try to incorporate something called the traveling shovel of death
Oh.
into their story. And most of my stories, it's, you know, a gardener uprooting a dead plant or whatever. It's kind of used fairly lightly. But there was one time where we did a word sprint, which is you set a timer and the delete key does not exist during that period of time, and you just write. And we had to incorporate the traveling shovel of death during this word sprint. And I went dark.
Yeah.
I went into a place in my imagination that I didn't think existed within me.
Ooh,
Yeah.
her shadow.
There you go. No,
And
it's-
when I finished that sprint, I was like, where did this come from? It scared me a little bit.
right.
I did not know I possessed that side.
Yeah, that's a perfect example of the shadow side and kind of it coming out in the work, right? And sometimes it seems like it authors itself. It'll just kind of pour right out of you.
So when you see something like that, you can kind of understand a little bit more, kind of circling back to Stephen King as to how he is able to tap into such darkness in his work.
Well, did you see after you were able to do that it helped you write because you were saying like the old or before you would do like overturning the dead bush or something. What has that opened up a new side of your writing or that
My
you're tapping
villains
into?
can be a little darker than they used to be. So
Oh, sure,
they're a little
sure.
more, there's more depth to them than there was before. Rather than a surface villain, there's more drive behind that, why they want to defeat the good guys.
Yeah.
So in one of the stories that I've been working on off and on for years, I don't know that I'm going to defeat my villain or not, if it's not going to be a happy ever after. I haven't decided.
Ooh, maybe it could be a tragedy.
Possibly. My characters haven't revealed that part of their story yet.
So it comes to you, like the characters choose their story and you get to...
In a way, yeah.
I've heard that about good writing, that it just sort of comes. For some people, it just comes out.
That's awesome.
Yeah. That's really interesting. But that's a perfect example of the shadow side of things. When a person taps into that part, a lot of times they feel more stable and strong and sort of solid in themselves. A lot of times if I have folks who have some dissociation attached to them and they are able or willing to jump into the shadow work, they'll find that they are much more able and willing to inhabit their body. In part, in those cases, a lot of times they have pent up rage and hatred that's relatively, justifiable isn't exactly the right word, but biologically understandable is probably a good way of putting it, right? So someone has mistreated you or, abused you, there's a part of your body that says, kill him, right? Pretty simple. There's a part of the brain that says, kill that guy, kill that gal. There's another part of the brain that says, that's a bad idea. I'm 9, for example. I'm a 9-year-old. Can't kill that guy. A, nobody will feed me. B, he's bigger and stronger and faster and meaner. So we cut that off from ourselves at the freeze response, just turns it off. But it stays there. And so when I tap into that shadow side of things, and a lot of it stays there too. It doesn't have to be somebody who's being abusive. Somebody cuts me off in traffic. There's a part of me, a savage part of me that wants for their immediate and unpleasant demise, right? That's just nature at work. Some people will let that up, and it has some pretty unpleasant consequences if I act on it. And that's why we have jails, right? Jails and prisons are for people who can't appropriately inhibit their shadow.
So part of that, I'm just curious.
Yeah, no, go for it.
A lot of times when we have that reaction, it's in response to something negative that has happened and therefore kind of threatened us. Is that part of like survival instinct?
Totally. It's exactly the survival instinct. The fight-flight system is a survival instinct, and aggression is a form of that, is a function of that, the fight-flight system, right? So when I am working with clients, I have a lot of clients, I can think of 1 or 2 right now, who really are not nearly aggressive enough, right? They're too passive in the world, and so the world acts upon them. People, they say yes when they want to say no, and they struggle to own kind of who they are and how they are in this world, and as a result, people walk on them, right? There's an old saying in psychology that says you train people to treat you the way they treat you. So if I'm in a situation where things are bad, there's a good chance that I trained my environment to do that to me. Now, there are some exceptions to that rule. There are situations where that won't apply. But an awful lot of the time, my own experience of things and my desire to please people, for example, will put me into a situation where I am being mistreated. And the part of the work that we do is to tap into the anger situation there, to tap into some of the pieces that are not appropriately put into the shadow. And it's often very scary for the clients. They say, oh my gosh, all this anger and rage in here, that's bad. That's the child within says, oh, this is bad. This is bad. I don't want to do this. I'll get in trouble. No, actually, you're getting walked on all the time, and you're angry and resentful, and you're pissed off, and you're, fill in the blank, smoking too much, eating too much, drinking too much, running around on your marriage, using drugs. Well, guess what? If if using drugs is your outlet and you're nice and accommodating when you're sober, well, you may have to make some changes, right? I can't remember why I started talking about this now.
Well, we're talking about what were we talking about? It was like why people will tap into that dark side, or why it comes out. So
so that's the
getting cut off on the highway,
getting that dark side incorporated to a point where I can access it, not necessarily act on it, but be aware of it and be aware of how angry I am. That is the survival instinct and the fight and the flight instinct. And when I can connect to that without deciding it's bad, but rather just feel it, then I can take action that's probably appropriate for me. Anytime somebody has a resentment, I have people who come to me in addiction. Everybody has resentments. That's like the hallmark of addiction. And I say, there's one of two things that's happening if you are pissed off, if you're resentful about something, if you're walking around bitter and frustrated. Either you have a problem and you're being taken advantage of and you're allowing it to happen and you have to stand up, or or somebody is you have unrealistic expectations of the world around you. One of those two things. Okay, it could be that you think life should be Pollyanna and easygoing. I have a guy right now who's been married for about a year and a half and is really surprised that marriage is hard, which I was too. I remember that experience of being like, wait a minute, this person isn't just going to do what I want her to do all the time.
It's going to solve all your problems if you get married.
Totally.
Have
Watch every movie ever made.
Gosh darn wives.
Seriously, tell you what.
Gosh darn.
This wasn't like this in the movies at all. It's very well. I had some very immature ideas about how relationships worked, and I may still even have some of these ideas. I'm not seeing that myself, but I've been given the feedback on occasion that I do in fact still have some mistaken beliefs about how relationships and marriages should work.
Yeah, my husband asked me why I didn't check his pockets before I put his laundry in the washing machine. It's like, well, I wasn't wearing them, so I don't understand why that would.
Yeah. So that's the thing to look into whenever I have a resentment is, am I being mistreated? And if I'm being mistreated, it usually has a lot to do with this shadow piece and with choosing not to stand up and choosing not to say no. And I can't say no because I have guilt and shame and fear and all this other stuff. And the challenge, of course, for those folks is when they do say no the first couple of times, it's ugly. It is, and it's because there's 20, 30, 40, 50 years of resentment, rage, bitterness, and anger underneath their no. And there's a program on top of it that says you're bad if you say no and don't do what you're supposed to do. So that's a really vital part of the process of recovery for a lot of addicts and just a living for a lot of other people.
I notice, if you turn on the TV or, pop open a news channel or anything, it's always, unfortunately, the school shootings, they happen more and more frequent. And you never hear, gosh, he was the happiest guy. He, everybody liked him.
Yeah.
It was always it always has been from the start that I can remember, a loner. People didn't like him. They were picked on, or, the bully.
Weird.
Yeah. And you're just, and I'm wondering that, not to condone it, but what pushed them to tap into that dark side? And is that,
I don't know if I think that's probably a sort of a separate situation. Really what you're looking at there is just somebody who decides to give up on life and to take their anger at the world to the next level. It's really, nihilism is the philosophy that nothing matters. And if we look at life and look at the inevitability of death, the inevitability of the loss of everything and everyone that we care for, it's not actually that hard to come to that conclusion that nothing matters. And particularly if I am an outcast or excluded, and if I play too much Grand Theft Auto. I've read an interesting study that linked, and this is 10 years ago now, but linked first-person shooter video games, the prevalence of first-person shooter video games with the prevalence of first-person shootings in schools. And I heard it on NPR. I can't remember what happened there now, or what that study was exactly, but it was a very memorable thing to listen to. Yeah, it's a challenge.
So as humans, we all have the dark shadow, as Dexter would call it, his dark passenger, maybe. But it was
Dexter's such a good example of the shadow.
I think his is a
again.
little bit more
I don't
intense.
necessarily recommend cutting people up and torturing them if you don't like them, even if they're naughty.
they were bad guys.
Yeah, even if they were bad.
They were
Well, that's
also
such a good
murderers,
example, though, right?
so-
That's such a good example of the culture condoning the shadow stuff. Like, what can I do to make this okay?
Yeah.
So that now my audience, the audience of Dexter, can just enjoy watching these people suffer and have some pain.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, because as a watcher, somebody watched the show, you would get upset when people would, this guy's killing bad guys. Like, you're welcome. Like, what's the problem?
It's a vigilante. It's a good thing.
He's doing the job that, wasn't getting done or whatever. But
Right.
so we've all got the dark shadow. What keeps us from tapping into that? Because there are people who tap into it. They're the people who are committing the murders. And
Well, it's one thing to be aware of something. It's another thing to let it own you. And actually, the absence of awareness of it is probably the most dangerous experience. The absence of awareness of the shadow can be very problematic. And I will act on my shadow without being conscious of doing it. And you'll see it a lot in politics, in either side of extreme. And actually, it's not even that extreme anymore. But you see people who the simple name of an opposing political figure to their lifestyle brings up just rage, right? Just this sort of almost confusing. You'll have a normal person, regular, ordinary gal or guy, and they just have this immediate, like the fangs come out, and they'll say awful, awful, terrifying, terrible things about a political figure or some sort of politicized position in the media. And it does a couple things. The media actually really trains those folks. All of us really. The media trains us to have extreme responses to certain situations and people, depending on their particular slant. And so that's probably the most common place you see it. So if I don't own my shadow, I won't be able to recognize that there's a part of me that wants to kill my perceived enemy. And then you'll see the stuff you saw in Germany back in the day, right, where we're just little by little. What do the Germans do? Constant repetition. Jews are bad. Jews are the rats. They would always dehumanize them first. Jews are rats. They're not human. And the propaganda continued and continued and continued. And eventually you got to a space where the entire culture was like, oh, yeah, they're not human. We'll let it go. And that, again, that's a consequence of not being aware that I have this peace within me, that I have this savagery within me, right? A lot of suicide is suicide sometimes can be related to a similar process. So that's the thing that happens. Owning my shadow and acting on my shadow are very different. Frankly, when somebody acts on their shadow, very rarely do they own it. Only in the case of somebody who's really sociopathic have they owned their shadow and decided that they just like to work. They just like to be there. They like to be in that space and have that. Most of the time, what'll happen is somebody, quote unquote, snaps, hanging around, driving down the street, somebody cuts me off in traffic, and all of a sudden, for the first time, it accesses a piece of me that I wasn't aware of. I had a client who was very abusive in his relationship, unfortunately. And he had gone his whole life without being abusive, and then the individual he was with said something that really got to him, and out it came. Okay, well, one of the things we work on is like, hey man, you got to own what's underneath there. And in this case, the person you're with isn't who you're mad at. You got a lot of anger, but it's not toward this person. You got to stop doing what you're doing, right? So that's the long answer to that short question. How do we? It's pretty natural to allow the shadow to leak out if we don't own it.
So how do you own it?
Well, first of all, becoming aware of it's pretty helpful. Getting the idea that it's there. Second, I can notice that I feel a sense of empowerment when I am aware of my own rage and anger it's not particularly useful to act on it. It tends to have consequences that are unpleasant. I had a therapist I worked with once, and he told me, he said, write down the most awful story you can think of with yourself as the bad guy, and do awful things as the bad guy, and notice the part of you that enjoys it. I didn't enjoy the assignment at all, but I did it. And there was a part of me that did enjoy it. The part of me, so I'm a hero in my family system. That's what I like to go help people, and obviously, given what I do, right? And so that a lot of the things that were being written were really incongruent with my sense of my personality and who I think I am. And he said, at the end of the exercise, you have to burn it. And the reason you have to burn it is because if you know you're going to burn it, parts of you will come out that you wish weren't there. And he was right. It was really, really awful material. And when I was done, wow, okay, there is a part of me that's absolutely disturbingly savage. And I can own that now. And now that I own it, it doesn't own me. And I find myself becoming actually quite a bit more tolerant in my life. Partly tolerant of other people, but also tolerant of my dislike of them, for example. Not as driven to like everybody. Not as driven to pretend to myself, right? To lie to myself. Like, oh, I'm a good guy.
Yeah.
I like this guy. No, I don't. Not really. You know? So those things are very, very helpful exercises as far as owning my own shadow and becoming acquainted with what that is.
Well, if I've learned anything, and I've learned a ton from you, is that, when we were back in the day, just survive. Didn't name our kids until they reached a certain
6.
age, or
The Romans didn't name their kids till they were 6.
And so there has to be that piece in us, that survival instinct to do whatever you have to do to survive.
Absolutely.
And over time, it has evolved into something maybe not as dark, but it's got to still be there, right?
It gets civilized out of us so we can be in close proximity without killing each other.
Yeah, because you were talking about like chimpanzees and
Oh yeah, when we were talking about Jane Goodall and some of her stuff, right? So yeah, Jane Goodall, and she discovered that the monkeys that she observed, the chimpanzees she observed, would go to war with each other and do awful, awful things. And then there would be chimps that grew up together in very close proximity and had played together as children. And she gives the example of one drinking the blood of its former mate after a sort of a dispute had caused the differing chimp groups to go to war, right? Just really awful, awful imagery. And everybody prior to that kind of thought war was a human invention, and that nature was kind of this, chimpanzees are kind of this placid, kind of chillaxed, relaxed group of people, and they were very disturbed at the time to discover, like, wow, there's something going on here. So if we look at evolutionary psychology as informative of our experience, we really do come to the conclusion that there are parts of us that are pretty rough. One of the things that's really interesting, I do a lot of work with PTSD and trauma. When people are in really awful survival situations, not unfrequently they will do things that they didn't realize they were capable of. The most common example is a young man going to war, or a young woman now. I've never worked with a female with combat experience. I'm sure there are plenty. But a young man goes into war and engages in behaviors sort of instinctively that really are pretty awful. And he has to come back and kind of look at that, see what it was. And you see that with people in crisis or hostage situations or other kinds of difficult situations. They have to deal with a piece of them that came out in that situation. I had a client one time who was abducted and eventually dispatched the person that abducted them. And that was very challenging. And it was done sort of swiftly and savagely and without thought, right? The client operated on instinct and remembers what happened, but doesn't remember it being a volition or a choice. Really interesting.
Just opportunities was there, and you do what you have to do to survive.
Boom, boom. Right? The hands flashed, and it was done. And she got away.
But you would never do that in a quote-unquote normal situation,
right?
Ever. And you could never see yourself doing that.
Exactly. And so the reality that I could do it, and at the time kind of enjoy it, and be really excited about it. Or survivor's guilt, too, when there's 3 of us standing next to each other, and the 2 people to my left get shot. My first instinct often is, I'm so glad it wasn't me. Well, if those people that got shot are my friends or family members, that's a hard thing to contend with. It's really difficult to deal with the part of me that is deeply selfish and savage if I'm not aware of it. If I'm not aware that it's there and it's just kind of part of the ball game. When you know it's there, a person can then deal with it. Even talking about shadow work will arouse the shadow in a certain percentage of people. I say, what do you mean? I don't have that. You're sick. Oh, maybe I am.
Give me 5 minutes. I'll be back.
Yeah.
Think about my shadow.
You think I'm sick? You don't know. You don't know the beginning of it.
Yeah.
You don't know squat.
Yeah.
It's way more than you know. So
Well, to hear everything that you hear on in your career, I mean, you've seen the worst of people. So.
Yep, that's for sure. You get a chance to see the darkness and the light, but man, human beings can be pretty awful. Well, that sounds like a kind of a peachy, happy place to end a podcast on the shadow.
Humans are awful.
Human beings can be pretty awful.
Oh, not are awful. Sorry, my
Can be
Can be.
awful. Yes.
for the one little word. Well, this was fun. I enjoyed as fun as like tapping into or noticing your
I
shadow.
liked it.
Having our round table. I like this. I think we should do it more often, and just a couple different perspectives there. And
Yeah, thanks for
kinda-
joining us today, everybody.
Thanks for having us.
Yes, this was fun.
Thanks. So Christina Abbey, Marilee Mills, Alicia Morgeau, and Greg Struve, thank you guys so much for tuning into Power of the Mind with Granite Mountain Behavioral Healthcare. You guys have a great day.
For information about mental health and addiction treatment, you can reach out to Granite Mountain Behavioral Healthcare online at granitemountainbhc.com. That's granitemountainbhc.com. Or give us a call at 877-338-6287. That's 877-338-6287. If you have a comment about this podcast or a question you'd like us to address in the podcast, you can check out the Contact Us page at my website, gregstruve.com. That's GREGSTRUV as in Victor, E as in Edward.com. This has been a Cast 11 production brought to you by Granite Mountain Behavioral Healthcare. This episode was produced by Austin Morrison. Follow Cast 11 on Facebook, Instagram, and Pinterest at Talking Glass Media.